In the late autumn of 1941, the military fortunes of the Soviet Union hung by a desperately frayed thread as the German Wehrmacht, propelled by the raw momentum of Operation Barbarossa, surged deep into the Eurasian heartland. To the world watching from afar, the rapid advance of the German army groups appeared to be an unstoppable tactical triumph, leaving the Red Army shattered and retreating across 1,000 miles of scorched earth. Yet, beneath the dramatic reports of frontline encirclements and captured metropolises, a far more fundamental and catastrophic crisis was unfolding behind the Soviet lines, one that threatened to permanently paralyze the Soviet war machine without a single shot being fired. The rapid German capture of the Ukrainian Donets Basin, commonly known as the Donbas, in the autumn of 1941 struck a mortal blow to the Soviet industrial infrastructure. The Donbas was not merely a territorial possession, it was the absolute energy engine of the Soviet Union, containing over 60% of the nation's high-grade coal mines and the vast majority of its coking coal deposits, which were essential to fuel the blast furnaces of the heavy steel works in the Urals and power the electrical grids of Moscow, Leningrad, and Vologda. The loss of this vital energy heartland meant that the Soviet Union was suddenly starved of the primary fuel required to smelt the steel for its T-34 tanks, forge the armor plating for its Sturmovik aircraft, and heat the industrial cities where millions of evacuated workers labored in open-air factories to produce the weapons of survival. If a replacement source of high-grade coal could not be secured and transported immediately, the entire Soviet industrial. To comprehend the sheer scale of the logistical and human challenge that lay before the Soviet Union in the winter of 1941, one must understand the absolute strategic paralysis caused by the loss of the Donets Basin. In the pre-war Soviet economy, coal was the absolute foundation of all industrial power, and the Donbas was its supreme supplier, producing over 94 million tons of coal annually. When the Wehrmacht occupied Ukraine, this immense energy flow was instantly severed, leaving the Soviet industrial heartland in the Urals and the besieged cities of European Russia facing an immediate, catastrophic fuel famine. The steel mills of Magnitogorsk and Chelyabinsk, which had been rapidly expanded to receive the evacuated machinery of hundreds of Western factories, were suddenly forced to operate on drastically reduced coal rations, threatening to halt the production of tank armor and artillery shells at the very moment they were most desperately needed. The Soviet State Defense Committee, the GKO, quickly realized that the existing coal mines in the Kuznetsk Basin of Siberia and the Karaganda mines in Kazakhstan were logistically incapable of bridging this massive deficit, as the single-track Trans-Siberian Railway was already choked with the eastward movement of evacuated industries and the westward transport of fresh military divisions. The only viable, high-grade coking coal deposits that could be accessed within European Russia lay in the Pechora Basin, centered around the remote Arctic outpost of Vorkuta. However, the Pechora Basin was a geographical nightmare, characterized by an extreme subarctic climate where winter temperatures routinely plunged to -50 degrees Celsius and the ground was frozen solid to a depth of hundreds of feet. The region was completely isolated from the rest of the country, accessible only during the brief summer months by navigating shallow, winding rivers that remained frozen for over 270 days of the year. To exploit this remote resource under the extreme pressure of wartime mobilization, the Soviet regime turned to the main administration of corrective labor camps, the Gulag, which was uniquely suited to execute massive, high-risk infrastructural projects through the ruthless expenditure of human labor. Under the direct control of the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, the NKVD, led by the sinister Lavrentiy Beria, the Vorkuta prison camp complex, known as Vorkutlag, was rapidly expanded from a small, primitive penal colony into a massive, industrialized empire of forced labor. The NKVD was charged with a dual, non-negotiable directive: first, to rapidly sink new coal shafts into the permafrost and dramatically increase coal extraction, and second, to construct the Pechora Railroad, a colossal, 1,200-mile-long railway line that would connect the Vorkuta mines to the main Soviet railway network at Kotlovka, providing a direct, high-capacity land route to transport the Arctic coal to the factories of the Urals and the boilers of Moscow. The human cost of this economic exploit was entirely irrelevant to the Soviet leadership, who viewed the prisoners of the Gulag not as human beings, but as a completely expendable, self-replicating resource that could be worked to death in the frozen wastes to secure the coal that would save the socialist state. The expansion of the Vorkuta camp complex and the construction of the Pechora Railroad during the height of the war represents one of the most extreme and brutal chapters in the history of industrial mobilization. Throughout the winter of 1941 and the spring of 1942, tens of thousands of prisoners were loaded into unheated wooden boxcars and transported to the northern railhead, from where they were forced to march hundreds of miles on foot across the trackless, windswept tundra to the remote mining sites. The prison population of Vorkutlag swelled rapidly, comprising a diverse and tragic mix of political prisoners arrested under the notorious Article 58, common criminals, Soviet citizens repatriated from occupied territories, and, increasingly, Axis prisoners of war and ethnic minorities deemed untrustworthy by the Stalinist regime. Upon arrival in the frozen wasteland, these prisoners found virtually no infrastructure. There were no barracks, no administrative buildings, and no heating facilities, forcing them to dig primitive dirt dugouts, or zemlyankas into the frozen earth simply to survive the howling Arctic blizzards. The working conditions in the Vorkuta coal mines were nothing short of medieval, as the prisoners lacked modern mining machinery, pneumatic drills, or even basic safety equipment. In the suffocating, pitch-black underground shafts, miners were forced to manually hack the coal out of the frozen seams using primitive picks, shovels, and iron bars, loading the heavy ore onto wooden sledges that were dragged to the surface by hand or by horses that quickly died of cold and starvation. The daily work shift lasted for 12 to 14 hours in sub-zero temperatures, and the prisoner's survival was tied directly to a brutal, output-based rationing system known as the *Kotlovka*. Under this system, those who failed to meet their astronomical daily work quotas were punished with drastically reduced food rations, receiving only a few ounces of watery cabbage soup and a piece of heavy, sawdust-filled black bread, which condemned them to a rapid, agonizing death from starvation and exhaustion. The guards and camp administrators, under intense pressure from the NKVD leadership in Moscow to meet the rising coal targets, enforced discipline with absolute, merciless violence, routinely executing prisoners who showed signs of physical collapse or political dissent, and leaving their frozen corpses in the snow to serve as a grim warning to the surviving laborers. Despite these horrific conditions, the Vorkuta mines began to yield results, as the volume of coal extracted from the frozen depths rose steadily month by month, providing a vital, growing trickle of fuel that was desperate to find a way to the frontline factories. While the extraction of coal from the permafrost was a monumental feat of forced labor, the true bottleneck of the entire Arctic coal lifeline was the construction of the Pechora Railroad, a logistical endeavor of unprecedented scale and difficulty. The proposed 1,200-mile route of the railway traversed some of the most challenging geographical terrain on Earth, crossing wide, turbulent Arctic rivers, cutting through dense, primeval northern forests, and laying tracks across vast expanses of unstable, waterlogged muskeg swamps that thawed into treacherous seas of mud during the brief summer months. The engineering challenges were compounded by the complete absence of heavy construction equipment, bulldozers, or steam shovels, meaning that every foot of the railway embankment had to be built manually using the raw physical power of the Gulag prisoners. Laboring in the freezing cold of winter and the suffocating, mosquito-infested heat of summer, teams of prisoners cleared the dense forests using handsaws and axes, dug millions of tons of gravel and dirt using simple shovels, and transported the heavy materials in primitive wooden wheelbarrows and horse-drawn carts to build the railway bed. The construction of the railway bridges across the massive, swift-flowing rivers like the Pechora and the USA was an agonizing ordeal, requiring prisoners to work in freezing water to drive wooden piles deep into the riverbed, often without diving gear or thermal clothing, resulting in hundreds of drownings and severe cases of hypothermia. The supply of rails and steel for the construction was critically limited due to the total mobilization of the Soviet steel industry for weapon production, forcing the NKVD to engage in desperate recycling measures. Teams of laborers were sent to dismantle existing, non-essential railway lines in the Soviet rear, and even the rails of the famous Moscow Metro and the secondary tracks of the Trans-Siberian Railway were ripped up and shipped to the Arctic to be laid on the Pechora line. The human toll of the railway construction was staggering, with historians estimating that for every single wooden tie laid on the Pechora Railroad, a human life was sacrificed to the cold, starvation, and exhaustion. The route became a vast, linear cemetery, where dead prisoners were buried in shallow graves directly beneath the railway embankment, their bones physically integrated into the foundation of the line. Yet, driven by the relentless, terror-fueled organization of the NKVD and the absolute strategic necessity of the war effort, the railway advanced relentlessly across the tundra, bridging the gap between the isolated Arctic mines and the desperate industrial centers of the south. The ultimate test of the Arctic coal lifeline arrived during the critical operational turning points of 1942 and 1943, as the massive battles of Stalingrad and Kursk decided the fate of the Eastern Front. During these titanic struggles, the Soviet industrial war machine in the Urals, particularly the legendary tank manufacturing complexes of Tankograd in Chelyabinsk and the Uralvagon Zavod in Nizhny Tagil, reached their absolute peak of production, turning out thousands of T-34 tanks, heavy self-propelled guns, and millions of artillery shells. This staggering industrial output, which completely caught the German military command by surprise, was fueled directly by the high-grade coking coal flowing down the newly completed Pechora Railroad from the frozen mines of Vorkuta. By the end of 1942, the first trains carrying thousands of tons of Arctic coal began to arrive at the steel mills of the Urals, providing the essential thermal fuel to keep the blast furnaces running at maximum capacity and allowing Soviet metallurgists to smelt the high-quality alloy steel needed for tank armor. The impact of the Pechora coal was felt immediately across the entire Soviet economy. It allowed the thermal power plants of Moscow and Vologda to maintain a consistent supply of electricity to the defense factories, heated the freezing residential blocks where the industrial workers lived, and kept the strategic railway networks of European Russia operating without interruption, ensuring that fresh divisions, ammunition, and fuel could be transported to the front lines without delay. The Vorkuta coal mines and the Pechora Railroad had effectively replaced the lost energy resources of the Donbas, providing the vital, resilient fuel cushion that insulated the Soviet Union from industrial collapse during the most dangerous years of the war. The Wehrmacht, which had confidently calculated that the capture of Ukraine would starve the Soviet Union of the industrial resources to wage a long war, watched in growing disbelief as the Red Army fielded increasingly massive, well-equipped armored forces that grew stronger with each passing month. The German intelligence services had completely failed to foresee that the Soviet regime could conquer the Arctic permafrost and build a highly active, high-capacity industrial lifeline through the ruthless exploitation of forced labor, showcasing the profound, tragic divergence between German operational planning and the raw, material realities of Soviet economic mobilization. The strategic and economic legacy of the Pechora Coal Basin and the Vorkuta Gulag system extends far beyond the immediate victory of the Soviet Union in the Second World War, shaping the entire geopolitical and industrial landscape of the post-war Soviet state. The massive infrastructure constructed by the expendable hands of the Gulag prisoners during the crisis of 1941 and 1942 became the permanent foundation for the rapid, intensive industrialization of the Soviet Arctic during the Cold War. Following the defeat of Nazi Germany, the Vorkuta mines were not abandoned. Instead, they were continuously expanded and modernized, transforming the remote penal colony into one of the largest and most productive coal-producing centers in the world, with the city of Vorkuta growing into a major, permanent Arctic metropolis of over 100,000 residents, complete with schools, theaters, and massive industrial processing plants. The Pechora Railroad was upgraded and integrated into the main Soviet transport network, serving as the vital logistical artery that carried millions of tons of raw materials, minerals, and timber from the rich, untapped northern territories directly to the heavy industrial zones of the Soviet Union. However, this post-war economic success remained permanently overshadowed by the horrific human tragedy that had birthed it, as the memory of the hundreds of thousands of prisoners who had perished in the cold, dark shafts of Vorkutlag and along the track of the Pechora Railroad was systematically suppressed by the Soviet state. The Vorkuta camp system remained highly active until its official dissolution in 1960, serving as a prominent symbol of the cruelty and efficiency of the Stalinist regime, where human lives were viewed as mere cogs in the immense, predatory machine of state-directed industrialization. The historical analysis of the Eastern Front must look beyond the dramatic tank battles and operational maneuvers to recognize that the Soviet victory was fundamentally an industrial and logistical achievement, won not only by the courage of the soldiers at Stalingrad and Kursk, but by the silent, agonizing sacrifice of the Gulag prisoners who labored in the frozen darkness of the Arctic to fuel the weapons of survival. The Arctic coal lifeline represents the ultimate, tragic paradox of the Soviet war effort, a brilliant, unprecedented feat of logistical engineering and industrial mobilization that was executed through the absolute denial of human dignity and the systematic destruction of human life, leaving a permanent, dark imprint on the very foundation of the Soviet victory.